So good morning. I'm Bonny Lin, Director of the China Power Project and Senior Fellow for Asian Security at CSIS. Thank you all very much for joining us for this event. Today's event will focus on Chinese military logistics, a key People's Liberation Army capability that supports China's ability to project military power and use military force. For many of us observing Russia's invasion of Ukraine, we're seeing how much logistic problems have impacted Russian military operations. China is similarly watching. The problems that Russia encountered in Ukraine have likely reinforced Beijing's need to further improve and strengthen its logistics. This will likely build on efforts already underway, including China's establishment of its Joint Logistics Support Force in 2016 as part of sweeping PLA reforms under Xi Jinping. As we evaluate China's ability to use force in its neighborhood or further abroad, it will be increasingly important to understand the state of PLA logistics and whether Chinese logistics can support and sustain significant military operations. This was the main topic explored at a late March, early April 2022 U.S. Army War College conference on studying the PLA. I'm grateful that several of the key speakers from that conference will be joining us today to share their insights and findings from the most recent research on PLA logistics. I want to note that the views that they are sharing today are their own individual personal views, and they do not represent the views of their particular institution, the Department of Defense, or the US government. So joining me today, and I'll name them in the order they will present, is Colonel George Shatzer, Director of Strategic Research and Analysis at the Strategic Studies Institute of the US Army War College. Going second after George will be Dr. Joel Wuthnow, a Senior Research Fellow in the Center for the Study of Chinese Military Affairs within the Institute for National Strategic Studies at National Defense University. Presenting together and after that will be DOD Analyst, Mr. Josh Arostegui. And then also with Josh will be also DOD Analyst, Major James Roger J.R. Sessions. And finally, Mr. Lonnie Henley, who is a professional lecturer at the Elliott School of International Affairs at George Washington University and retired Defense Intelligence Officer for East Asia at the Defense Intelligence Agency, will help us wrap up the panel. So many thanks for all five of you for taking time out of your schedule for this panel. I'll first turn the floor to George, who will share why the U.S. Army War College decided to focus on PLA logistics. What is logistics, and what are the high-level insights he may have? And after all of our panelists provide their remarks, I will moderate a short Q&A discussion. To submit a question, please write your question using the QA chat function on Zoom. So George, over to you.
Bonnie, thanks so much. The Army War College and the Strategic Studies Institute really appreciate you and CSIS organizing and hosting this panel following from the PLA conference. As you noted, the Army War College hosted it back, that was actually 31 March through to April this year at Carlisle Barracks in Pennsylvania. Just if I could, some brief history about the conference series. It actually began all the way back in 1990. Strategic Studies Institute has been organizing and hosting it since 1999. The last fully in-person meeting prior to this year was in 2018, and that was due to COVID and scheduling issues. So we were really thrilled to be back this year with an in-person event. And we were also very excited to have as our new co-sponsor, the National Ground Intelligence Center, or NGIC. And we thought that more fully involving members from the intelligence community really helped elevate kind of the discussion and the ideas that were exchanged. Additionally, we were pretty fortunate to have General Charlie Flynn, the commander of U.S. Army Pacific, as our keynote speaker to open the conference. And we also had Ms. Xanthi Karas, the principal director for China and the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy Office, as a special guest speaker. And having the perspective of both senior leaders, we thought really made the event especially strong. So as you stated, the focus of the conference was on PLA logistics and sustainment. Sometimes those two terms, logistics and sustainment, get confused or used interchangeably. But there is a critical distinction. Within U.S. military doctrine, at least, sustainment is the broader provision of critical supplies, functions, and services to maintain operations until hopefully mission accomplishment. Logistics is just one of the critical aspects of sustainment. Others include personnel services, healthcare, and even financial support. Logistics, though, is specific to the movement and support of forces, acquiring goods, storing them, transporting them, maintaining equipment, and even constructing facilities. So we chose logistics and sustainment as the conference focus. We're really back in the fall of last year and well before the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Mostly we did so because we recognized that the topic of logistics tends not to get as much attention as the combat capabilities of the PLA. And as the PLA continues to build and modernize its combat forces, it's important to examine if the capabilities meant to support combat operations are also being developed. Because as General Flynn said in his keynote remarks, logistics is the oxygen of battle. And that's really such great imagery. I think that gets the point across. You know, imagine if two fighters couldn't breathe. The fight wouldn't last long. Or imagine if one fighter could breathe freely and the other was constrained in some way. The advantage for the other fighter would be obvious. So a state can build all the combat power muscle at once. But if it can't feed that muscle or move it to where it needs to be, then that combat power won't be very effective or won't even survive very long. So it was a full conference, as you said, and I'll just, for the benefit of those listening in, I thought I would briefly mention each of the paper topics, the panels that we had, and who the authors were. So our first panel was on national level logistics, looking across the whole of China, if you will. And we had a paper on joint force logistics support to theater commands. That was Joel presented that paper, and he's on the panel today, of course. We also had a paper from Aaron Richter at DIA and a co-author Ben Rosen at SOCI. They focused on mobilization support to logistics and sustainment. Then we had our second panel was on service level logistics, the actual services within the PLA themselves. And we had a paper focused on the PLA Army logistics. Josh and JR were the authors there, and they're on the panel today. We also had a paper on PLA Navy and their at-sea sustainment capabilities. Those authors were Justin Bogus and Travis Dolney out of the Office of Naval Intelligence. And then to wrap up that panel on service level capabilities, we also had a paper by Eli Turk from the China Aerospace Studies Institute at Air University. And he focused on PLA capability to sustain air combat operations, as you might expect. Our third panel was logistics in remote regions and overseas. The first paper there was, you were one of the co-authors, the PLA's growing air power projection capabilities in the Western Theater, specifically Western Theater Command, particularly along the border region with India. And then our last paper was by Dr. Chris Young at Marine Corps University. He looked at logistics and sustainment issues in the PLA base in Djibouti as kind of a test case to understand how the PLA might seek to sustain and project power from a remote location. So that's a quick rundown of the papers we had and the authors. So as you can tell, it was a full slate. I think it was a really good event overall. So as we've been building the conference reports coming out of the event and compiling the papers into a volume for publication later this year, hopefully in the fall timeframe, many key points I think stood out really. But for me, they shared a common thread, and I would term that the question of experience. Does the PLA have the practical understanding that typically comes from the experience of operating against a live enemy? Does the PLA truly know how to execute sustainment and logistics well enough to support a major military operation over time and over distance? So it's one thing to make plans on paper. It's another to field some capabilities in garrison. It's yet another to exercise those capabilities in war games or training events. But until a military has to fight against a deadly thinking enemy, deal with the fog and friction of modern war, it's tremendously difficult to know if systems such as sustainment will be able to bear the heat and weight of actual combat. The conference authors pointed out, as I said, many great points. Some of them you'll hear from here in just a moment. But I think a couple of these help highlight that question of experience. There are real questions about the command relationships between the PLA theater commands and the Joint Logistics Support Force that could lead potentially to an inefficient transition to wartime logistics. And if the PLA isn't proficient in making this leap to a new structure during war, how well can they be assured that even works for them? Another author pointed out that at the national level, there are different views within China about the chain of command for the defense mobilization system. If these divergent views are serious enough, would China really be able to sustain a large-scale operation that requires generating resources over the long term? There seem to be some surprising shortfalls in logistics support for PLA Army combat battalions. And additionally, the PLA makes, we think, little use of containerized goods at the brigade and lower levels. So if the PLA doesn't have enough people or units dedicated to supplying the fight, or it isn't using modern logistics methods, then how long can the PLA really expect to operate at the tactical unit level where the fighting really takes place? And then finally, other authors assess that the PLA Navy has a low number of replenishment ships, given the size of its combatant fleet, and that the PLA Air Force facilities often seem to lack enough aircraft apron space for maintenance operations. So I don't mean to suggest that the conference found that the PLA is incapable of sustaining large-scale military operations. Our discussions highlighted some notable potential shortfalls and points of friction within the PLA. That's true. But we've also seen that the PLA has successfully sustained counter-piracy maritime operations for many years now, as well as conducted non-combatant evacuation operations far from China. They've also evidenced an increasing ability to move forces across the vast distances of China and conducting large-scale exercises. They've just not done any of that with a modern military shooting at them. So with the focus of this panel in mind, as you mentioned, we've seen how Russia struggled early on in its war against Ukraine. Russia had months to build its invasion force, uncontested, and to put the sustainment systems in place. They chose the timing of the operation, and they were moving across land to an immediately adjacent country. And yet Russian forces faltered pretty badly in the face of Ukrainian resistance, unable to sustain operational momentum more than a couple of weeks before they had to retract and reset their forces. So with some of the unknown issues in PLA sustainment, how would the PLA be able to project decisive combat power, say, across the 90 or so miles of the Taiwan Strait against a modern force that's intent on defending their independence? The conference didn't really arrive at, I don't think, at any firm conclusion on that particular question, but it did tell us that we have a lot more work to do to understand the PLA sustainment capabilities. And so I think with that, I'll close there, and I really look forward to hearing from the other panelists. And again, really appreciate the opportunity to participate today.
George, thank you very much for a great laying down of how the conference went, as well as the topics covered at the conference. As George mentioned, we'll first turn to Joel for his the paper that he presented, which was on joint PLA logistics, particularly at the theater level. So Joel, over to you.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Bonnie, and delighted to be here. So I'm going to dive right into the contents of the paper. So what I was doing for this conference was sort of a high-level look at the organizational transformation of PLA logistics. So over the last decade, the PLA itself has undergone a monumental organizational change under the leadership of Xi Jinping. Many different elements of this. Logistics has been somewhat overshadowed by some other changes, the creation of the theater command system, the creation of the strategic support force, and other changes. But it's quite significant, I think, for the reasons that George laid out, that sustainment and logistics are quite critical enablers of warfighting for any military, including the PLA. So what I'm going to do here is to give you a quick overview of the key findings of the paper and then tee things up for Josh and JR. So the first thing I think that needs to be said is that for the PLA, there's a critical distinction between joint and service logistics. This is how they talk about logistics. So service logistics would be things like specialized spare parts, certain transportation units, basically anything that is owned and accomplished within the individual services. Joint logistics refers to general purpose activities, things like fuel resupply, food, water, medical services and supplies, things that cut across service boundaries. And so for the last 25 years or so, the PLA has been in a process of consolidating as much as possible these sorts of general supplies and to some degree transportation for the purpose of reducing costs and increasing efficiency. So the major change under Xi Jinping has been further consolidating joint logistics into a single entity. So prior to the reforms, joint logistics in the PLA were handled within the 7 military regions. And so you didn't have one single supply chain, for instance, for fuel, you had 7. And so what the PLA has done since 2017, when this organization was rolled out, has been to create this entity called the Joint Logistics Support Force, which is a national entity that oversees these functions across the entire PLA. And so there are a couple important reasons why they have done this change. First has been to further increase cost efficiency and management of the logistics system. And so now you can further consolidate supply chains, you can improve standardization of logistics resources, you can oversee the disposition of assets and resources at a national level, and you need a national level headquarters to do that. And the other reason is really operational. And so China faces a number of important contingencies, mostly around its border and coastal regions. So if you have a single operational logistics headquarters, what you're able to do is to garner, muster resources from not only a single region, but from across an entire national level supply chain, and to be able to surge those resources to the critical point in a timely way. And so we actually saw this on full display two and a half years ago now, in the opening phase of China's response to the COVID epidemic in Wuhan, in which the Joint Logistics Support Force was basically tasked with leading the response. So providing medical services, providing critical medical supplies, building makeshift hospitals, and so on. But those resources were marshaled not only from the vicinity of central China, they were gathered from everywhere in China and brought by rail, by air, and by ground transportation all the way into Wuhan in a fairly timely way with, in my view, a fairly high level of success. And so this was really the first critical test or operational practice, if you will, for the Joint Logistics Support Force. So they were fighting an epidemic, not fighting an enemy, a human enemy, if you will, but they did achieve some success, and I think they derived some lessons from that experience. So the trade-off that the PLA made in moving to this consolidated system, though, was the reduction of unified control at the theater level for logistics functions. So as I said earlier, prior to the reforms, the military regions owned joint logistics. After the reforms, those functions were shifted. So theater commanders, the senior operational commanders responsible for different sectors of China's borders, essentially, no longer have at their disposal a direct authority over joint logistics forces. They have to ask. So they have to ask someone else for those resources and those personnel to be transferred to their command during a contingency. And so this is problematic for the PLA because it reduces unity of command. It creates a system, as George mentioned earlier, in which critical support functions need to be transferred. And so that creates the possibility of bureaucratic delays. It creates the possibility of tensions and frictions between theater commanders who may want all sorts of resources at their disposal and central commanders who may not want to do that because those things need to be reserved for other contingencies that may happen at the same time. And it also raises the question organizationally of who would actually be in charge of those joint logistics forces once they are transferred to theater commanders, because in peacetime, in normal steady state, the theater commands have no level of command. There's no one there who does joint logistics. And so this is really a question of, during wartime, when you lead into a conflict, whether it's over Taiwan or anything else, how quick, how efficient, and how smooth that transition would be and how it would go. Currently, PLA logisticians haven't yet decided what the wartime model should even look like. They have several different models they're wrestling with, each of which has different pros and cons. But the debate that's underway in China sort of goes to show you that they themselves haven't really figured out what this transition is going to look like and how during wartime these joint logistics forces will actually be commanded. And one other point before I wrap up here is that making things even worse for the PLA is that operational commanders, so theater commanders and their key deputies, tend in their careers to have no logistics expertise. So this is a bit unlike the US military, in which commanders may occasionally serve a tour in a J4 or a logistics shop of some sort, or at least have some kind of exposure to this discipline, so that when they reach higher command, they know how to task logistics units and they understand the basic doctrine. But in the PLA, the career tracks are very stovepiped, and so very few operational commanders have ever done a tour in any kind of logistics billet. And so from the perspective of overall cohesion of joint operations in the PLA, this is a human element that could be somewhat of a weakness as the PLA faces the uncertainties of battle. And so finally, sort of what does this mean for everyone else? So this is problematic for the PLA. They are starting to try to coordinate things. They are doing some training exercises involving the theaters and the Joint Logistics Support Force. But I would still regard this as something of a weakness or a disadvantage for the PLA for the reasons I talked about earlier. And so for other countries who are thinking about deterring China or thinking about operational concepts if things were ever to go into a crisis, the logistics system, I think, is something of a soft underbelly of the PLA that could pose problems, but also potentially opportunities for other countries, whether it's the United States or a regional opponent of China. And so that could range from things such as attrition, highly attriting Chinese forces and making it very difficult for them to be resupplied, which is an issue that we saw in Ukraine with the Russians, or things as sophisticated or complicated as non-kinetic or kinetic operations targeting the links that hold together China's centralized logistics system. And so those are things that could be used in peacetime to increase deterrence, to make the PLA really worry about its ability to sustain forces, or things that could be employed during wartime to create operational problems for PLA forces underway. So with that, let me stop there and yield to the real logistics experts, Josh and JR. Thanks.
Thank you, Joel. And as Joel mentioned, we'll next turn to Josh and JR. I think Josh will present first and then JR, but they both worked on their paper together. So Josh, over to you.
Hi, thanks, Bonnie. Joel, far from a logistics expert, but we're really focused on the PLA Army, and our paper was really designed to get after or tackle the easy task of outlining the massive number of changes and sustainment forces and capabilities made to an equally massive Army. So we first started by looking into the reorganization of the Army sustainment elements following the PLA's force-wide 2016 strategic level and 2017 tactical level restructures. This included researching numerous Chinese journal articles, discussing how the PLA Army thinks about logistics, but also went a bit more in the weeds with counting trucks on CCTV videos and observing how the PLA was actually supporting its most remotely garrisoned forces. But a big focus for us was really on low-level reorganizations. The Army made the new Combined Arms Battalion its basic combat unit and pushed out a permanent service support company and a medical platoon to the battalion. In addition to new engineering, signal, and reconnaissance platoons, Combined Arms Battalion commanders now had organic access to vital support units like vehicle repair and rescue, medical evacuation, motor transport, and supply platoons. I know that sounds like a lot of mundane ground force speak, but what it really translates to is enabling the battalion to potentially carry out small-scale independent operations without heavy reliance on support from above. These are kind of lessons learned from how the Russians operate their battalion tactical groups. They push a lot of stuff down to make it organic to Chinese Army commanders to make them better prepared to operate those forces in wartime. But while having more organic support assets than its motorized infantry battalion peer in the Russian Army may seem like an edge, the restructure also provided one staff officer to the battalion command team to oversee comprehensive support. We look at this as a real significant weakness for China. In contrast, the U.S. Army typically has 4 to 6 personnel performing similar roles. The next step up, the new Combined Arms Brigade also underwent many changes. It was given a service support battalion to consolidate all brigade echelon logistics and equipment support roles under one commander. This had allowed them to better enable task assignment of those assets down to Combined Arms battalions or across the brigade. But it also allowed the brigade to keep those assets organized the same in both peacetime and wartime, improving operational readiness to a certain extent. The brigade support department staff was also reorganized to kind of mirror higher echelon staffs, which potentially would help streamline sustainment processes. However, those staff numbers are also pretty small at brigade levels. So a few key takeaways from lower tactical echelon sustainment that will remain a challenge for PLAA include medical support, which, while noted in PLA writings as being more combat focused, remains primarily a rear area capability with minimal capacity for frontline support. Battalion repair platoons, which are kind of new, especially those in mechanized units, are insufficient in size and experience to conduct battlefield salvage operations. Their high-level brigade counterparts, while better trained in various chassis repairs, shoulder a heavier burden these days with that rapid increase in high-tech systems getting fielded across the force that they're also responsible for. Much like the Russian counterparts, motor transport units at these tactical echelons are simply not enough. Although the Chinese are fielding various types of new heavy equipment transporters and general purpose trucks at these lower levels, the number is still not sufficient for the long distance maneuver actions these brigades are expected to execute, which leaves them heavily reliant on civilian support or even JLSF support. As our friend Dennis Blasco regularly points out, these support elements at the brigade level have several contract civilian cadres assigned to support military personnel. Although they often bring more technical know-how, it remains unclear if they would perform their roles in a conflict or if their sudden absence would hamper brigade sustainment functions. Moving up a little bit higher to the Group Army, or as we would roughly a U.S. Corps equivalent level, and military district and theater Army echelons, there were additional changes made to the organization of the staffs up and down echelon, like I mentioned before, but also the forces that would provide layered approaches to medical equipment and supply support. The group armies were each given their own hospital, which is a new thing. However, there are some issues with making them combat focused when they're still heavily involved in the commercial business of civilian healthcare. Additional repair and transport capacity was placed in our new service support brigade. Although the unit's primary focus is on establishing a group army command post, those sustainment battalions can support lower echelon units as required. However, they're not enough for large-scale combat operations, leaving, again, heavy reliance on JLSF and civilian support. At military districts and some theater armies, they have their own motor transport brigades that look very similar to JLSF motor transport brigades, supply forces in the most complex border terrain of Western and Southern China. But command and control of those might be a touchy subject later on. For now, I'll hand it over to JR to explain how the PLA Army uses its reorganized logistics forces to carry out supply requests and fulfillments up and down echelon, as well as discuss how the Chinese view their own insufficient capabilities at different levels. Thanks.
Thanks, Josh. On paper, PLA ground force logistics are a joint enterprise harnessing the full advantages of large-scale sustainment. Feedback from PLA logisticians suggests that additional refinement and investment is required to overcome long-standing limitations of PLA's supply in order to sustain ground forces in a maneuver conflict like that in Ukraine. Conceptualizing ground force supply and distribution, PLA academics describe three echelons: strategic level, predominantly consisting of large-scale suppliers and warehouses; campaign level, roughly theater command and service level entities; and tactical level for logistics and group armies and below. We're primarily concerned with the campaign and tactical levels. PLA and PLAA logisticians envision a logistics system where tactical units transmit requirements up to the group army or brigade level, and then these requests are sent to theater command, service, and/or joint offices for campaign level planning, tasking, and fulfillment. Interestingly, the PLAA has different reporting channels in peace and wartime. During peacetime, tactical units liaise directly with lower level service and joint entities. In wartime, however, the requests are all consolidated at the highest logistics office in the theater command to, in the PLA's words, ensure the theater most effectively utilizes its logistics capacity by centralizing requests. During a dynamic maneuver conflict like Ukraine, centralizing logistics command and control may not facilitate the dynamic decision-making needed to keep units supplied. Transitioning from ground logistics command and control to distribution processes, PLAA texts detail 4 methods of supply distribution. We'll discuss 3 below the strategic level. The first method is the independent method, whereby campaign level entities supply tactical level units, and then tactical units internally complete sustainment requirements. The second, a slight adjustment to the standard independent model, is the direct method, where campaign level entities directly provide goods to lower level tactical units, bypassing group armies and potentially other tactical levels. Method 3, the military civilian joint method, which is intended for both peace and wartime, integrates local logistics firms like Dongjing or SF Express to distribute goods from campaign level sites to tactical units. The first and second methods are conventional military logistics operations, but how effective civilian logistics firms will execute method 3 in a war zone is unknown. Pivoting from logistics organizations and processes, PLA observers note myriad shortfalls in post-reform logistics that mirror similar problems Russian forces reportedly have faced in Ukraine. First, commentators frequently note that logistics command and control processes remain incomplete or convoluted. For example, movement requests sometimes require 5 or 6 layers of approval, drawing criticism from PLA logistics planners. Second, authors criticize the PLAA for overwhelmingly seeing highways and railroads as the primary form of projection for land units. Although air and sea movement are included in some exercises, the so-called railroad transport and motor movement method remains the standard, which is seen as a so-called peacetime transport organization that PLA observers believe does not satisfy the requirements of real combat. Lastly, PLAA logisticians complain of a lack of equipment and capability, which has been previously discussed by others, Joel and Josh. Examples include the PLAA's ratio of heavy equipment transporters, HETs, to tracked vehicles being 1 to 18, which is far below the US proportion of 1 to 7. Another, as discussed, is containerization, which despite its widespread use commercially is not consistently utilized at the brigade level and below. In conclusion, tremendous changes occurred in PLA logistics after the below-the-neck reforms in April 2017. The diffusion of logistical support provides lower-level commanders with additional resources. The PLAA continues to work through issues on by reforms and legacy PLA logistics challenge. Determining the actual capability of the PLA is always difficult, but PLAA writing suggests that PLA ground force logistics would be challenged to effectively support dynamic, large-scale ground operations in its current state. Thank you for your time and attention, and I'll turn it back over to Bonnie.
Thank you. Thank you both, Josh and JR. Let me turn now the floor to Lonnie for your thoughts on overall the key highlights from the conference, but also helping us to sort of tie it all together. So Lonnie, over to you.
Thanks, Bonnie. My role in the conference was to step back from the details that were laid out very effectively in the various papers and think about the overall state of the field. How well do we really understand PLA logistics? And in particular, how well can we answer the most important questions about the PLA that are logistics related questions? And my overall message was that we made a lot of progress, but we still cannot address the hard questions. We can't answer the hard questions. Let me lay out those questions for you. The first couple of questions surround a potential major conflict between China and Taiwan, and China and the United States over Taiwan. First big question, can the PLA logistics force project the combat force across the strait and sustain it in combat operations on Taiwan? How much capacity do they have for logistics power projection at that relatively short range of roughly 100 to 150 miles off the Chinese coast? A lot of the examination of PLA capabilities with regard to a Taiwan invasion center around the lack of the ability to move those forces across. We've been looking lately at the PLA's very large effort to supplement military logistics with civilian mobilized assets. But there's a lot more to be done on that. We still cannot answer the question of, can the PLA really get its forces across? And if it gets them across, can it sustain them in combat on the island? Closely related, can the air forces in particular sustain the long fight? As we've all been reminded by Ukraine, and things that we should have always had in mind after Afghanistan and Iraq and many other recent conflicts. You may think it's going to be a short war, but it can turn out to be a very long war indeed. If you're not prepared to fight the long war, then you're not prepared for the war. And I have particular questions about the PLA Air Force's and Naval Aviation's ability to sustain high intensity, large scale combat operations over long periods of time. Can the maintenance forces turn the planes around day after day after day and get them back in the air? Do they have enough engines? How long can they use an engine between having to pull the engine for overhauls? How many spare engines do they have on hand for overhauls? How many overhauls can they do at a time? I personally suspect that the PLA Air Force can only sustain combat operations for about 2 weeks, but we really can't answer that question because we don't have the data and we haven't had the focus on those questions that we need in order to develop the data. Closely related, how resilient are PLA logistics operations? Somebody's going to be shooting back. Can the PLA logistics apparatus sustain enemy attack and continue to function effectively? close to China, as in Taiwan, and even more of an issue farther from China, such as in the South China Sea or potential crises farther afield. Fourth big question. It is clear now that the PLA does not have the capability to project large-scale combat forces far from China. They could not fight a war in the Indian Ocean. They could not fight a war in the Middle East or Africa. Do they aspire to those capabilities in the future? Are they trying to build the power projection logistics structure, never mind the power projection command and control structures and intelligence structures and so forth? But for our purposes, do they even want to be able to do what we did to project large combat forces halfway around the world and fight a major war against a sizable opponent? Final big question. If there is a major war between China and Japan, China and Taiwan, in either case with US involvement, it's highly likely that China will be cut off from trade with the outside world, or for most of the outside world, for at least the duration of the conflict and possibly for some time thereafter. How resilient is China itself to that kind of cutoff? How well could China endure a long-term effective blockade, whether it's actual military blockade operation or not? The result is the same. China will not have very much contact with the outside world. How well can China continue to sustain military operations in those conditions? So we can't answer any of these questions. So I greatly applaud the progress we've made in studying PLA logistics, but we're not where we need to be in this area yet. We cannot yet do what our customers, our interested audience need us to do, which is tell you whether the PLA can actually fight the long war against a major opponent. So that was my not very cheerful conclusion. Thank you.
Thank you, Lonnie. I think there are many points that you raised that we want to address. But before that, and before I go into more detailed Q&A, I saw a number of questions in the chat box with folks asking, when will the papers be out? So George, if I could turn to you, some were asking when the paper will be out. Is there going to be a physical copy? What do you have a sense of the timeline?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. So as I said at the outset, I anticipate having the volume of all the papers, including a write-up of Lonnie's assessment and one additional chapter that was provided later after the conference to pull a few things together. I anticipate having that all out and published, as I said, a little bit later this year in the fall timeframe. It's hard for me to give an exact date because of the publishing queue here at the War College, but I think fall is realistic. It'll be available for download as a PDF from the War College website, our press website. Hard copies, we tend, in the modern digital age, we tend not to do too many print copies. Those that we do, we tend to reserve for military and government recipients. It is possible for the general public to order hard copies through the government printing office. That connection does exist, but they won't be made widely available in print form for circulation. The main way that the general public will be able to access it will be as a PDF download, but it will be freely available to anybody that would visit the website.
Thank you very much, George. So I'd like to now turn to the broader Q&A, and I actually want to go back to a question that Lonnie pointed out as a question we can't quite answer right now. But I do want to see if maybe Lonnie, Joel, and others might want to weigh in. So we know that a Chinese amphibious invasion of Taiwan is incredibly complex. How would you assess right now how prepared is the PLA logistically for such an operation? So Lonnie, maybe you first, Joel, and then to George if you want to weigh in too.
Well, this is a matter of great debate among the PLA watching community, and the debate centers around the apparently inadequate force structure of PLA Navy amphibious lift vehicles, ships. If you wanted to run this operation the way a US military planner would run the operation, then the PLA Navy doesn't have nearly enough amphibious lift capacity to do it. I wrote a paper for the Navy War College last year making the argument that I don't think that's how the PLA envisions running this operation. I think that they envision military lift for the assault echelons, and then turning to a heavy reliance on mobilized civilian shipping capacity to get the rest of the force ashore and for the entire sustainment portion of this. But that, of course, depends upon successfully capturing and operating ports on the western coast of Taiwan. And it's not guaranteed by any means that they could do that. But my contention is that that's how they think about fighting this war, and that they have done a lot to prepare for that model of a cross-strait lift. There's a lot of people who disagree with me on that.
Thank you, Lonnie. Joel?
So as Lonnie said, there's been a lot of papers written recently about the issue of lift, things that can be counted. We have in our forthcoming volume at NDU on cross-strait operations, yet another contribution to this, making the point that military sea lift and airlift are both insufficient. And as Lonnie mentioned, they're trying to think through creative ways to make up for those shortfalls without necessarily just simply producing a whole lot of extra gray hull ships and airplanes. But beyond this, there's also the question of other kinds of materiel that they may need to stockpile for either a short or a protracted conflict. And I don't have a good answer to this, but I would channel some PLA logistics writings in which you get the sense, reading these things, that the anticipated materiel requirements are really quite prodigious, really huge. So things such as number of hospital beds that you might need, things like just the amount of oil that you would need to have on hand. According to PLA analysts in their logistics community who have looked at this in great depth, and specific in the context of the cross-strait operations, just have these astronomical figures, in part because they're anticipating very high levels of attrition. And so these are things that can be counted. I think, the other layer to this are sort of the intangibles. How well prepared do they sense that their logisticians are? How well prepared are their troops? How well do they consider the quality of the training and the joint training in which logistics has to be merged into these other kinds of operations? And so here I suspect there's also concerns and doubts in the PLA about their ability to do this, not only in peacetime but in the exigencies of battle. And also, kind of the final point would be the lessons they may be driving from Russia's weaknesses in Ukraine, which have, underscored kind of a hubris in Russia and really severe limitations when faced with an opponent that is blowing up bridges and targeting, logistics supply chains that are overextended and so on. But what exactly is the PLA inferring from this for a cross-strait, which is different in many ways, similar in others? But, is this actually further undermining their own confidence in their ability to perform these very difficult tasks? That's an open question in which I don't think there is data yet to analyze.
Thank you, Joel. Very comprehensive answer. George, anything else you wanted to add?
Just briefly that, the question of will comes into play here. There's been a lot of commentary in the context of the Russian-Ukraine conflict about, the will to continue to fight and to resist. And so, the PLA today could conduct a military operation against Taiwan to put pressure on the Taiwan government, be that through sorties, be that missile strikes, etc., air sorties, etc. But is that pressure enough to defeat the will of the Taiwan government, to get it to capitulate and submit to the PRC's will? It's so incredibly difficult to answer that question, because at the same time that we're assessing the PLA's sustainment challenges, Taiwan government and armed forces would be facing many similar sustainment issues. The island has to be supplied with its own goods to sustain its own fight, and that adds another huge variable into the already tremendously complicated calculus of trying to assess whether the PLA is going to be effective. So you could ask all the same questions for the Taiwan Defense Forces as well. So I like to think that if Taiwan is determined to resist a PLA military operation, that it would take more than the PLA has to defeat Taiwan's will. But that's very much a question of what's up in the head as much as it is what's on the ground. What do you have on hand?
Thank you, George. So I see a couple of questions as well as some of the questions submitted beforehand. Going back to the original event title, which is understanding the PLA logistics compared to problems that Russia faces. So maybe I could turn to Josh and JR to offer their initial thoughts. Do you think that the PLA suffer the same logistic problems as Russia, particularly since the two militaries have learned from each other? And if I could add on to it that, to what extent has the PLA learned from Russia in terms of logistics?
Go ahead, JR.
Okay, perfect. I'll hop in. First, Bonnie, to address your learning comment, the PLA is always watching and learning from other people's conflicts, no matter how big or small. Obviously, we can all assume that they are intently watching the Russia-Ukraine scenario to learn and look and see how, a big ground force, one after which they model themselves in some part performs. So they're definitely watching, but fairly early in the game, I don't know if we've seen yet lots of exactly what observers, PLA observers are thinking. As far as how, maybe some challenges Russia's having in Ukraine might befall the PLA. We've already talked about containerization and palletization of equipment. It's extremely hard to get things on and off trucks. It's much easier to do if they're in a huge container and I have a forklift. If I'm unloading all those things by hand, which from my understanding, a lot of Russian units are having to do, you add a lot of time, you make yourself a big target, et cetera. And that's something that PLA logistics writers talk about, is a lack of containerization in lower level units. Additionally, and Joel hit on this, but there were PLA authors writing about a lack of stockpiling and a lack of pre-positioning. And the details weren't exact, but apparently, a PLA logistician thought it would be worth writing a paper on pre-positioning. So makes one wonder how much the PLA is doing it. And lastly, just this kind of being forced to stay on roads and railways, make yourselves a big target, and those, large static places can also be easily disruptive. So Josh, I don't know what else you want to add on there.
So I agree with everything that JR is saying as far as the processes and stuff go, but the PLA is also, learning from the US as far as force modernization to not have to deal with the types of issues that they're seeing Russia, deal with. A lot of universal chassis being fielded across medium and light brigades give them a wide range of unit capabilities that field all types of systems, whether it be firepower or electronic warfare or logistics or even combat systems, but that are way more sustainable. So instead of improving their logistics in a lot of ways, they're actually just making their forces, at least newer forces, easier to sustain. So that way, if combined arms battalions built out of 8x8 or vehicles are all going in, they're all going to be using the same chassis for the most part. Now, this doesn't really apply to the heavy combined arms brigades the PLA has, because those would have the same issues that any heavy unit would have, the US, Russia, whatever. But other systems, this is what they're doing. Instead of improving processes for the most part, they're just making things easier to sustain.
Great, thank you. So we have a lot of questions in the chat, so I don't think we'll be able to address them, but let me group a couple of them together. Several of them seem to be responding to Lonnie's comment and asking about how capable or whether the PLA is able to engage in a protracted conflict. So Lonnie, I don't know if you want to weigh in and if others want to weigh in on that question. I think it's a little bit different than just logistics as a statement, but Lonnie, maybe turn to you first and see if any others want to weigh in here.
Well, I'll expand on the sort of air battle as an example. I talked about the challenge to the logistics force of turning the aircraft around, day after day after day for weeks and months of conflict. That's sustaining a long, large, high intensity air war is the hardest thing air logistics guys can do, but it's also hard for other parts of the force structure. Just personnel management. You can, most air forces find that you can turn around planes faster than you can turn around pilots. And so if you're going to sustain high intensity operations, you've got to be managing your pilot rest hours and have a large enough pool of pilots and be rotating them into the operation and out. That's very hard. It's also extremely hard on the intelligence and targeting force structure. It's one thing to launch your force to attack a bunch of pre-planned targets that you've been looking at for 10 years, and that the first 2 days of the air war, you've got your target folders sitting there. But beyond that, it's an ongoing dynamic process of assessing the results of the previous days or couple of days of battle, seeing which of your targets are still active and still need to be reserviced, building new target folders for a rapidly changing situation. This is an enormous task that the entire PLA Air Force has never done. They have never had to conduct an air operation longer than a couple of days in some of their larger Air Force exercises. And they've never had to conduct an operation that goes beyond their pre-planned target deck. And I just don't think, until you do that, you don't understand how hard it really is.
Great, thank you. Joel, did you want to weigh in too?
Just briefly, I think just to kind of step back on the question, and it's about how well prepared the PLA is for a protracted conflict. I think there seems to be a predisposition among sort of PLA doctrinal thinkers that you're going to get into a conflict that can be a high intensity but short duration conflict, and in part because that's kind of what they want to prepare to do, in part because some of the examples they have looked at, such as the Falklands or others, have been relatively short duration. And so you have, for example, sort of conceptual writings about what an island landing campaign would look like, in which you have this extensive mobilization and then a very kind of brief preparatory and assault phase, and then sort of the thinking kind of trails off. Sort of the resistance will just sort of melt away once we decapitate the regime. Not necessarily as much thinking about what things could look like on D-Day plus 2 months or something like this, when you're still mired in a very difficult situation, not only needing to sustain your forces, but also just needing to continue operations. And so the question, I think, is when you look at things like their counterinsurgency training, I think you see some improvements over the years in urban warfare counterinsurgency types of trainings, but I think one of the real clues will be when they next revise their operational doctrine, and it seems like they're kind of at the leading edge of doing this. But whether or not and how the Russian conflict plays into the process of updating the doctrine, and whether they assume, well, there's a branch in which we don't succeed on D-Day +1 and we have to continue to fight much longer, whether that really gets instilled into their doctrine and ultimately their training and their capabilities, I think that's one of the key questions that we will continue to monitor.
Thank you, Joel. I just want to know, I saw two of our guests raise their hands. I actually can't call on you, so if you have questions, please type them in the chat. So I want to give a couple of other questions. There seems to be a number of questions on the role of civilians in PLA logistics. And there's also one question on the role of humans versus, I guess, artificial intelligence. So maybe I could turn to see if either Josh or JR want to weigh in on any of those issues.
Sure. As mentioned, we are seeing a lot more civilian cadre get integrated into the support elements of PLA Army, specifically up and down echelon. We think that they're bringing a lot of technical know-how, but again, they're wearing uniforms, and but what they're actually what they're going to do in a time of war is a gap to us, right? But that's just the military based civilians. We are seeing the civilian military integration that we always talk about playing a role across the board, and a heavy reliance on it. So whether it be supplying forces near the border or even going over borders, it's going to be moving units requires a whole lot of lift that the PLA Army just does not have. When I say lift, I mean, land-based, so heavy equipment transporters, trains, et cetera. So there's a heavy reliance on those civilian agencies and now a reliance on the JLSF to coordinate those functions. We saw a movement to reorganize some of those staff departments to help support staff departments to help put new offices in there that would be better integrated with the civilian agencies. We've seen it in action. It's especially out in Xinjiang along the western, the most furthest west. But again, for protracted warfare, this is one of those ones that I'll just touch back on this. The Chinese right now, and they're very clear in their own writings, they're not prepared for moving beyond the border at this point in time. At least rail lines, we're talking about rail gauges and everything too. Their support system is designed to rely on civilians to get to where they need to be within the country. But anywhere beyond that becomes problematic. JR, do you have anything you want to add?
I'll just add from my research that there, as Josh hinted, a lot of issues with the PLA working with local commercial firms, things like personnel not having enough experience or knowledge, limited coordination mechanisms, and my personal favorite was the stubborn insistence of commercial firms to make a profit. PLA units at all levels are trying to make those connections, but not even in peacetime, they're having issues with execution. So when the bullets start flying, it just adds a whole nother level of complexity.
Thank you. So Lonnie, let me turn to you, but George, I'll turn to you last to help wrap up the panel since we're running up on our time.
Just wanted to say briefly that the China has an enormous apparatus to mobilize civilian resources to support military operations. And this seems not to be a stopgap measure because the PLA logistics system is not yet good enough. It seems instead to be how the Chinese feel that they should fight this war, to rely upon the enormous resources of the world's second largest economy as a component of China's military power. But as Josh said, there are, and JR both, there are many questions as to how well that will work, but it won't fail for lack of organizational effort. That's what I'll say.
Actually, George, if you don't mind, let me answer one more quick question before turning to you. I'll wrap this up. So one of the questions that I just saw come in was, how visible would we see Chinese logistic preparations if it was ready to use significant military force, whether that's against Taiwan or any of its neighbors? Would we have clear advance notice indications, or would that be a bit more difficult for us to see? So whoever wants to weigh in on this question.
Okay, so this is always one of those touchy ones that how often they're going to broadcast exercises and training events that would include large scale mobilization of their logistics forces or integration of JLSF with other services to prepare for large scale combat operations. It's how willing are they to broadcast that to the open public? That's a difficult one to assess. But maybe I don't want to throw this to Joel, but Joel, if you have any idea about the JLSF stuff, it might be a good IW.
Yeah, I mean, just briefly, the easiest observable would be productions of ships and airplanes that are relevant to transporting troops, and we can see that they're launching new Type 075s or Type 071s, et cetera, Y-20s, so things that can be counted and that they will release. But again, even if you can get onto that, there's this entire intangible layer that's not only matters of training and human capital, but of internal perceptions about how good you are. And so even if you have all this stuff, do you believe that it's reliable? Do you believe that it's maintainable? Do you believe that your people are able to address problems when they occur, and so on? And that, I think, is really one of the critical things that we as outside observers will never have a good lens on. If it appears it's in Chinese media and designed for political purposes, but what do they really believe about their own capacity? That, I think, could be very consequential, but very, very difficult to grasp, to quantify.
Thank you. So in the interest of time, let me just turn it to George for any final closing comments you have, particularly since you were the main organizer for the conference.
Yeah, thanks again, Bonnie, and thanks to all the authors, those who were able to join us today and others who weren't. It was a great event, and we really appreciate the support from so many different agencies and organizations to make it happen. As a closing thought, I'll just say, if we look at the way the conflict in Ukraine has unfolded to date, I think most observers would say that Russia made the decision to go in to Ukraine, and it would take a lot to throw them off of that and to have them reverse course. Once they made the decision to commit, they were going to commit until they achieve their objectives. We've seen a lot of rhetoric surrounding that issue in the Ukraine war. So initially, when Russia tried some operations that maybe it wasn't that well suited to, at least historically anyway, in terms of longer range operations, trying to do more of kind of a lightning strike, decapitation perhaps into Kyiv and a couple of supporting places, and that didn't work out for them, and they had something to fall back on. And what they've fallen back on now is a pattern of operations that they're very comfortable with historically, and arguably their force is better structured for that kind of grinding, using a lot of fires and making incremental gains over time. And they seem like they're relatively better able to sustain that. Why do I mention all that? In the context of China, the PLA attempting to conduct an operation, say, against Taiwan or another adversary, they probably, I think a lot of people would agree that China will have also made the very tough decision to commit to that operation no matter what. They're going to be very, very committed to it. But what I worry about a little bit is because China's modern military experience, PLA's modern military experience, is relatively limited compared to that of Russia. Yes, the invasion into Vietnam in the 70s, the Korean War in the 50s. But what does the PLA have to fall back on if in the first few days or few weeks, their initial operations don't work well? I'm not sure that even the PLA knows what its style of fighting ought to be, its mode of operations ought to be, that they can comfortably fall back on and continue to prosecute operations. They write an awful lot about what that is, intelligentized warfare, covering all the domains, et cetera. But kind of going back to my opening remarks, they just really haven't had the opportunity to actually build experience conducting those against an actual adversary. And so, again, if the PLA stumbles early on, it'll be, interesting is such an insufficient word. It'll be very challenging to understand where China goes from there, because they will have made such a deep, kind of emotional, personal commitment to achieving their objectives that it could have, I think, profound effects on the security of the region. So I don't know if that helps a lot, but that's kind of something that I was thinking about in terms of the context of the Russian-Ukraine war and what China may be taking away from it. But again, thanks to CSIS and you, Bonnie, for doing this panel.
Thank you, George, and thank you everyone for joining us. My apologies that we're 4 minutes over, but I hope that was a very productive discussion. For those of us, those who want more information, this will be posted online, so I believe it'll be a day or two. But if you want to revisit any portion, it will be online. And as George mentioned, the papers will also be out later this year. So thank you again for everyone, and thank you for joining us.